Welcome back to Bedtime Biographies, where we settle in for the evening with the lives of history's most fascinating figures. Tonight, we're spending time with a man who was many things all at once: a printer and a scientist, a diplomat and a dreamer, a founding father and a humble candlemaker's son. His name was Benjamin Franklin, and his life is a story of extraordinary curiosity and quiet determination that unfolded across nearly a century of American history. Born in Boston on a cold January day in 1706, Benjamin Franklin would go on to become what many have called the first American. He snatched lightning from the sky, as one admirer wrote, and helped snatch freedom from tyrants. He was a printer who built an empire from ink and paper, a scientist who peered into the mysteries of electricity, an inventor whose creations still touch our lives today, and a diplomat whose quiet wisdom shaped a young nation. He signed the documents that mattered most: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Paris, the Constitution itself. The only person to do so. But before all of that, before the fame and the achievements, Benjamin Franklin was simply a boy in colonial America, driven by an insatiable hunger to understand the world around him. His story is one of transformation, of a mind always tinkering, always questioning, always reaching for something just beyond his grasp. So make yourself comfortable wherever you are tonight. Settle back into your pillow, dim the lights, and let's journey together through the remarkable life of Benjamin Franklin. But first, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Let's begin. A Candlemaker's Son in Boston. Chapter 1. A Candlemaker's Son in Boston. The winter of 1706 arrived in Boston with the particular cold that settles into harbor towns, where the Charles River carries a chill that seems to penetrate even the sturdiest buildings. It was in this season, on January 17th, by the reckoning of the modern calendar, though recorded as January 6th by the old style still common in the colonies, that Josiah Franklin's youngest son drew his first breath. The child would be named Benjamin, and he would enter a household already thick with the names of siblings and the routines of a tradesman's family. The Franklin house stood on Milk Street in the province of Massachusetts Bay, a modest address in a town that was itself modest, still finding its footing as a colonial settlement. Josiah Franklin, the boy's father, was a man of steady purpose, if not great wealth. He worked as a tallow chandler, a soaper, and candlemaker, occupations that rendered him essential to the community and fragrant with the work of his hands. His father before him, Thomas Franklin, had lived in Ecton, in Northamptonshire, England, and there Josiah had been born on December 23rd, 1657, to Thomas and Jane White. The old country lay behind them now, though its imprint remained in the straightforward manner of the family, in their adherence to craft and utility. Josiah Franklin had married twice, each marriage spreading children before him, like seeds in a field. His first wife, Anne Child, had borne him 3 children before they made the crossing to Boston in 1683, and 4 more came after their arrival in the New World. Anne's death left a quiet absence in the household, one that was filled on July 9th, 1689, when Josiah married again. This second wife was Abiah Folger, a woman with her own lineage of consequence, though not of wealth. They were married at the Old South Meeting House by Reverend Samuel Willard, the solemnity of the occasion marking the gravity of the union. With Abiah, Josiah would father 10 more children, and Benjamin, born into this crowded household, would be his 15th child overall, his 10th and final son. Benjamin's mother, Abaya, carried in her person a kind of quiet American history. She had been born in Nantucket, Massachusetts Bay Colony on August 15, 1667, to Peter Folger, a man who worked as both miller and schoolteacher, occupations that suggest a mind turned toward both practical knowledge and intellectual improvement. Her mother was Mary Morrell Folger, who had herself been an indentured servant before becoming Abaya's mother. The Morrell line traced back to the Pilgrims themselves. Mary came from a Puritan family that had fled across the Atlantic in 1635, seeking religious freedom when King Charles I had begun his persecution of those who would not bow to his church. Such ancestry carried weight, not in the form of money or land titles, but in the form of conviction and the willingness to sacrifice for conscience. Peter Folger, Abaya's father, was the sort of rebel destined to transform colonial America, a man whose beliefs led him into conflict with authority. As clerk of the court, he had been arrested on February 10, 1676, and jailed on February 19 of that year, his inability to pay bail sealing him in confinement. He spent more than a year and a half imprisoned, a long stretch of darkness that testified to the depth of his principles. This was the blood that ran in Benjamin Franklin's veins, not merchant aristocracy or inherited power, but a tradition of intellectual independence, of conscience made manifest through action. The child who grew up on Milk Street in Boston was surrounded by this mixture of practical trade and moral conviction. The household was crowded with siblings, the noise and bustle of a large family whose rhythms were governed by the work of candlemaking. Young Benjamin would later recall that he was generally the leader among the boys, a detail that suggests he possessed even then a quality that drew others to him, not through domination, but through some natural capacity to envision and encourage what others might attempt. There is something in such a recollection, offered years later when the man reflected on his childhood, that carries the weight of truth. The boy who led was perhaps already the boy who thought, who noticed, who saw in the river and the streets of Boston possibilities that others had not yet imagined. Josiah Franklin, like many fathers of the period, possessed hopes for his son's future that reached beyond his own station. He harbored the thought that Benjamin might attend school with the clergy, might enter that learned profession that promised respectability and security. But such ambitions met the hard obstacle of circumstance, money, always the limiting factor in the lives of tradesmen, constrained what was possible. Josiah could afford to send the boy to school for 2 years only. Benjamin attended Boston Latin School, where the classical foundations of education were laid. Latin, the grammar of thought itself, the structure through which all learning was organized. Yet, he did not graduate. The financial necessity that had limited his schooling to 2 years meant that formal education ended when Benjamin was 10 years old, a turning point that might have seemed an ending, but was, in truth, a beginning of a different sort. What schools could not provide, the boy would seek elsewhere. His parents spoke of the church as a career for him, a profession that would have satisfied Josiah's desire to see his son rise above the candlemaker's trade. But the practical realities of the household, and perhaps something in the boy's own nature, turned him toward different work. He worked for his father for a time, becoming familiar with the textures and rhythms of the chandler's craft, the slow heating of tallow, the dipping of candles, the smell that permeated everything. At 12 years old, Benjamin was apprenticed to his older brother James, a printer, and in that moment the trajectory of his life shifted. James Franklin represented a different world from their fathers. Printing was a trade that dealt not in animal fat, but in ideas, in the physical manifestation of words. It demanded precision, cleanliness of a certain sort, an understanding of letters and their arrangement. It required the ability to see something in its component parts and assemble it into something greater. James taught his younger brother the printing trade with the authority of an older brother, which is to say, with a mixture of instruction and severity that characterized the apprenticeship system of the period. Benjamin learned to set type, to understand the press, to move through the workshop with the knowledge of where things belonged and how they functioned. It was in 1721, when Benjamin was 15 years old, that James founded the New England Courant, the third newspaper to be established in Boston. This was a remarkable achievement for a young printer, and it marked the beginning of something new in the colonial press, a publication that would not content itself with merely reprinting news from London or publishing official proclamations, but one that ventured into commentary and opinion. The Courant became a forum for ideas, and it was within this forum that the young apprentice, frustrated by his brother's refusal to allow him to publish his own contributions, took an action that would reveal something fundamental about his character. Denied the chance to write a letter to the paper for publication, Benjamin Franklin adopted a pseudonym. He created the persona of Silence Doggett, a middle-aged widow with opinions and observations about the affairs of the town. Mrs. Doggett's letters were published, and they became a subject of conversation around Boston, the kind of local entertainment that made people pause in their daily business to discuss what the widow had written. Neither James nor the readers of the Courant were aware of the ruse. The letters were clever, observant, and touched with a wit that suggested a mind of more than ordinary capacity. When James eventually discovered that his younger brother was the author of the popular correspondent that had captured the town's attention, his reaction was one of unhappiness. There is something in such a moment, the revelation of deception, the claiming of authorship by one who had been denied the opportunity to claim it openly. That speaks to a character already formed, already convinced of the right to speak. It was during these years that Benjamin Franklin began to formulate principles about freedom and speech that would guide him throughout his life. He was an advocate of free speech from an early age, a conviction that crystallized when his brother faced consequences for his printing. In 1722, James published material that was unflattering to the governor, and for this transgression, he was jailed for 3 weeks. Young Benjamin, now in his mid-teens, took over the newspaper in his brother's absence. In the pages of the Courant, he had Mrs. Doggett proclaim a sentiment that would echo through his entire life. Quoting from Cato's letters, she declared that without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. These were not merely words printed by a boy in a colonial newspaper. They were a statement of principle, a claim about what mattered most in human society. The apprentice had already begun to become the man. Yet life under his brother's roof, even with the accomplishment of publication, remained constrained. The relationship between the apprentice and his master, for that is what James was, despite being Benjamin's brother, grew difficult. The discovery of the Silence Doggett deception had created a rift, a sense of betrayal that could not easily be healed. Benjamin Franklin, now in possession of skills and convictions of his own, no longer wished to remain subordinate. He left his apprenticeship without his brother's permission, an action that carried legal weight and social consequence. In departing, he became a fugitive, a young man who had broken the bonds of apprenticeship and thereby placed himself outside the protection of the system that had taught him his trade. A candlemaker's son in Boston, the flight from Boston was not undertaken lightly, nor was it without cost. At 17 years old, Franklin possessed the skills of a printer and the convictions of a man who had tasted the power of the written word. But he also carried with him the weight of transgression. An apprentice who fled his master without permission was, in the eyes of colonial law and society, a lawbreaker. The bonds of apprenticeship were meant to be binding, a contractual obligation that the young man could not simply dissolve by departing. His brother James would have legal recourse to pursue him, and Boston, for all its possibilities, had become a place where Franklin could no longer remain. The city that had shaped him, that had given him his first printing press and his first audience, had also become confining in ways that his ambition could not tolerate. Philadelphia beckoned as something new, something distant enough to offer genuine escape and, more importantly, opportunity. When Franklin arrived in that city at age 17, he came as a fugitive with nothing but his training and his wits. He was, by his own later recounting, a figure of some comedy, a runaway boy, arriving in the streets of the leading colonial city, appearing somewhat disreputable after his journey. Yet the very fact of his arrival there was itself an act of remarkable determination. He had severed himself from family, from the only life he had known, in pursuit of something he could not yet fully name, but which he desperately desired: autonomy, the chance to build something of his own, freedom from subordination to his brother's will. In Philadelphia's printing shops, Franklin began to rebuild himself. He worked in several establishments, moving from one to another, never fully satisfied with what any single position offered. This restlessness was characteristic of him, not the aimless wandering of a lost youth, but rather the careful searching of someone taking the measure of what was available to him. He was learning not just the work itself, but the business of printing, the economics of running a shop, the relationships between printers and their patrons. These were lessons that would prove invaluable in the years to come, though at the time they were simply the ordinary transactions of survival and advancement. It was during this period of exploration that Franklin encountered Sir William Keith, the governor of Pennsylvania. Keith was impressed by the young printer, by his intelligence, his industry, his apparent dedication to self-improvement. The governor made Franklin an extraordinary proposition. He would back him in establishing a new newspaper in Philadelphia. For a young man of Franklin's ambitions, this was a gleaming possibility. It seemed to offer everything he had lacked in Boston: the support of a powerful patron, the resources to establish himself as a printer proprietor rather than merely a hired hand, the chance to shape a publication according to his own judgment. Keith suggested that Franklin travel to London to acquire the necessary equipment for such an undertaking, promising his financial backing for the venture. The prospect of England itself held profound appeal for Franklin. London was the centre of the print world, the place where the most sophisticated books and periodicals were produced, where the intellectual currents of the age flowed with greatest force. To go there as the proc of a royal governor, with funds to establish himself, seemed an opportunity that could hardly be refused. Franklin accepted Keith's offer and made the Atlantic crossing. In London, however, the realities of his situation became grimly apparent. Keith's promises dissolved like morning mist. The governor's backing, upon which Franklin had built his plans and his expectations, proved illusory. There was no money forthcoming, no resources to purchase printing equipment, no foundation upon which to build the newspaper they had discussed. Franklin found himself in a foreign city, far from home, with depleted resources and deepening disillusionment. He had travelled across an ocean in pursuit of a phantom. Yet even in this disappointment, Franklin demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that would define his character. Rather than despair, he found work as a typesetter in a printing shop in London, labouring at one of the more physically demanding aspects of the printing trade. The shop where he worked occupied space in what would later be recognised as the Lady Chapel of the Church of St. Bartholomew the Great in the Smithfield area of the city. At that time, the building had been deconsecrated, stripped of its religious function, and repurposed for commercial work. It was a far cry from his hopes of establishing himself as a proprietor, but it was employment. And it was in London, the intellectual capital of the English-speaking world. This period of working in the London printing house proved formative in unexpected ways. Franklin was exposed to the practices of English printers, to the standards of English printing, and to the intellectual atmosphere of a city that was at the forefront of Enlightenment thinking. He absorbed these influences, stored them away in his remarkable memory, and later carried them back across the Atlantic. These were the years in which the provincial boy from Boston was, in effect, completing an education that formal schooling could not have provided. After approximately 2 years in England, Franklin made his way back to Philadelphia. His return was facilitated by Thomas Denham, an English merchant who had himself emigrated to the colonies but returned to England. Denham employed Franklin in his mercantile business, taking him on as a clerk, shopkeeper, and bookkeeper. This represented a departure from printing, a venture into the world of commerce and accounting. For a time, Franklin seemed willing to pursue this new direction, to try his hand at something other than the print trade that had defined him since his apprenticeship. But this interlude in Denham's employ lasted only a few years. When Denham died, Franklin found himself once again without a position, once again forced to decide what path to follow. The choice he made was to return to printing. It was the trade he knew, the skill he had perfected, and increasingly, it was the avenue through which he could exercise influence over public affairs. In 1728, at age 22, he established a printing house in partnership with Hugh Meredith, a fellow craftsman. The partnership was not destined to be permanent, but it was the beginning of the enterprise that would make Franklin's fortune and establish him as one of the most influential figures in colonial America. By 1729, Franklin had become the publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, a newspaper that had previously struggled under the editorship of Samuel Keimer. In taking over this publication, Franklin recognized immediately what he must do: transform it from a collection of borrowed extracts and provincial announcements into something vital and relevant to the life of Philadelphia. He swept away the mechanical reprinting of dictionary entries and vapid news. He filled the Gazette with essays and observations of his own composition, commentary that ranged across questions of public policy, moral instruction, and the affairs of the community. His wit was evident throughout. His capacity to draw readers in with satire and humour balanced against serious argument. This was the beginning of Franklin's true emergence as a figure of consequence in colonial society. Through the Gazette, he found the perfect vehicle for his convictions and his talents. He could address the people of Philadelphia directly, could influence opinion, could advocate for reforms and improvements to their common life. And more than this, he could do so in a manner that earned him respect and social standing. His work as a printer and editor gained him a reputation as an industrious, intelligent, and public-spirited man. Long after he had achieved fame as a scientist and a statesman, he would sign his letters simply as B. Franklin, printer, not from false modesty, but because he understood that printing was the foundation of everything else he had become. The Runaway's New Beginning. Chapter 2. The Runaway's New Beginning. First half. The Pennsylvania Gazette became, in those years of Franklin's editorship, far more than a vehicle for the mere dissemination of news. It was a tool of transformation, both of the colony's public discourse and of the man himself, where his predecessors had contented themselves with reprinting items culled from gazettes across the Atlantic, often with scant regard for relevance or accuracy. Franklin filled his pages with observations drawn from his own pen, commentary that bore the unmistakable stamp of his judgment and his wit. Essays on matters of public concern appeared alongside pieces of moral instruction. The affairs of the community became the province of serious reflection, combined with an intelligence that could make readers smile, even as they were persuaded towards some new understanding of their common condition. It was through these columns and articles that Philadelphia began to perceive Franklin as something more than a competent tradesman. He was a voice worth hearing, a mind worth engaging with. The reputation he built through the Gazette served him well in the years that followed, establishing him as a man of industry, of genuine intelligence, and above all, of public spirit. He would carry that identity with him for the remainder of his life, the identity of a printer first and foremost, for he understood that the printing press had made everything else possible. Yet even as the Gazette flourished and grew in influence, Franklin's ambitions extended beyond the printed page. In 1732, when he was 26 years old, he began to publish an almanac under the name of Richard Saunders. This pseudonym gave him a certain freedom, though it was no secret in Philadelphia that Franklin himself was responsible for the work. The character of Poor Richard, as he came to be known, had a particular voice, plain and pragmatic, marked by a sly humor and a gentle self-deprecation. The sentences were declarative and direct, carrying the air of folk wisdom distilled to its essential form. What made Poor Richard's almanac remarkable, and what would eventually make it an institution throughout the colonies, was the quality of its observations. Franklin drew upon both original compositions and borrowed material, but the whole was shaped by his hand into something distinctive. The proverbs and adages that appeared within its pages had the ring of truths hard-won through experience, presented with just enough wit to lodge themselves in the memory. "A penny saved is twopence dear," the almanac declared, though later generations would remember it differently, altering the phrasing in ways that perhaps made it more memorable still. "Fish and visitors stink in 3 days," offered a sharper observation on human nature, one that combined humor with a certain astringent wisdom. These sayings, these brief pronouncements on the conduct of life, became the possession of his readers in a way that more elaborate philosophical treatises might never achieve. The first issue of Poor Richard's Almanac was published in 1732 for the year 1733, and its success was swift and enduring. Franklin sold approximately 10,000 copies each year, a remarkable number for the colonies, and the almanac became something approaching a necessity in households across British America. Its readers came to regard it not merely as a calendar and a record of astronomical and meteorological information, but as a companion that offered guidance on matters both practical and moral. The character of Poor Richard, with his gentle ironies and his accumulated wisdom, became familiar in a way that few literary figures in the colonies had managed to do. Franklin had discovered that wisdom, at least in the folk understanding of it, meant the capacity to offer an apt adage for nearly any occasion, and he proved himself a master of this art. In 1741, having firmly established his reputation through the Gazette and through Poor Richard, Franklin began another publishing venture. the General Magazine and Historical Chronicle for all the British plantations in America appeared under his name, offering a new form of publication to the colonial audience. The cover bore the heraldic badge of the Prince of Wales, a choice that reflected both Franklin's respect for authority and his understanding of what might appeal to his readers. Here was another avenue through which to shape colonial opinion and to establish himself as a figure of significance in the intellectual life of Pennsylvania and beyond. Yet Franklin's literary endeavors were not confined to these public works. He wrote, as well, for purposes more private and for audiences more restricted. In June of 1745, he composed a letter titled Advice to a Friend on Choosing a Mistress, addressed to a young man whom he sought to guide in the management of certain carnal impulses. The letter was frank in its discussion of matters that most writers of the age approached with greater circumspection, and for that reason it remained unpublished during the 19th century, when standards of propriety regarding such matters were particularly strict. It was only in later times that this document would resurface, eventually to play a curious role in legal proceedings, when federal courts would cite it as evidence in their arguments against obscenity laws and in defense of freedom of expression. These years of the 1730s and 1740s were years of expansion and consolidation for Franklin. He had arrived in Philadelphia as a young man. With little but his energy and his skills, he was becoming a figure of substance and influence. The printing business flourished under his management. The Gazette and the Almanac generated income and reputation in equal measure. Yet it was clear to those who knew him that Franklin's ambitions extended beyond commerce, even beyond the world of letters and publishing. He had begun to concern himself with matters of broader import, with the welfare of the community, with the improvement of public institutions, with the ordering of civic life itself. In 1736, the year after he had become postmaster of Philadelphia, Franklin founded the Union Fire Company, an undertaking that reflected his emerging sense of civic responsibility. It was one of the first volunteer firefighting companies in America, organized in response to a need that the city's existing authorities had not adequately addressed. Here was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Franklin's life: the identification of a gap in public provision and the determination to fill it through private initiative. Firefighting in those years was a hazardous and challenging work, and the fact that men would volunteer for such service spoke to the persuasive power of Franklin's vision of community cooperation. In that same year of 1736, Franklin undertook another task of a different kind. He printed a new currency for New Jersey, applying innovative anti-counterfeiting techniques that he had devised. This work brought him into contact with questions of monetary policy and economic management, matters that would occupy his attention in various forms for decades to come. He had already published, in 1729, a pamphlet titled A Modest Enquiry into the Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency, in which he had advocated for the use of paper money as a stimulus to economic activity. Now, through his work as a printer and through his growing influence in Pennsylvania affairs, he found himself in a position to influence actual monetary policy in the middle colonies. Franklin's printing presses became instruments of economic policy as much as of communication. The money that he printed was sound money, produced with safeguards against fraudulent imitation. His advocacy for paper currency, combined with his influence on colonial legislatures, helped to shape a monetary system that proved more successful than those adopted in other colonies. The middle colonies, under the influence of men like Franklin, managed to expand the supply of money in their economies without triggering the excessive inflation that had plagued other regions, and without allowing the kind of deflation that strangled commerce. By mid-century, when Franklin made his case for paper money before the British House of Commons in 1766, he would be speaking from long experience of the practical benefits of a flexible monetary system. His position as chief clerk of the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly, a post he held from 1736 until 1751, placed him at the center of colonial governance at a crucial moment. From this vantage point, he could observe the mechanics of political life, could understand the interplay of interests and personalities, could learn the arts of persuasion and negotiation. These were years of apprenticeship in public affairs, undertaken while his printing business provided him with the economic security to afford them, while his public achievements in these years commanded attention and admiration. Franklin's personal life proceeded along its own, more private course. The years of his mounting success in business and public service had not been unmarked by domestic strain. His wife Deborah, left at home in Philadelphia during his extended absences, carried the burdens of household management and the raising of their children. Her fear of the sea meant that she never accompanied Franklin on any of his extended trips to Europe, a circumstance that kept them apart for long stretches. The couple had known separation before, but the nature of Franklin's commitments in London, his roles as colonial agent, his scientific pursuits, his growing involvement in the great questions of empire and rights, meant that these absences grew longer and more frequent as he aged. There were perhaps deeper sources of estrangement between them as well. Another possible reason why they spent much time apart is that he may have blamed her for possibly preventing their son Francis from being inoculated against the disease that subsequently killed him. Such a wound, if it existed, would not have been openly acknowledged, yet it might have cast a long shadow across their marriage. Deborah wrote to him in November 1769, saying she was ill due to dissatisfied distress from his prolonged absence, but he did not return until his business was done. The words suggest not merely a wife's loneliness, but a deeper emotional toll. She would not see him again. Deborah Reed Franklin died of a stroke on December 14, 1774, while Franklin was on an extended mission to Great Britain. He had been in England when she fell ill, and the news would have reached him only after an interval. He returned in 1775, coming home to a house that no longer held his wife. She had endured his absences with what forbearance she could muster, managing his affairs in Philadelphia, protecting his reputation, maintaining the household he had built. Her death marked the end of an era, the era of his youth and his rise, the era when Deborah Reed had been the steady presence in his Philadelphia life. Yet there was another domestic concern that had long occupied his thoughts, one that predated his marriage and had shaped his household in ways both acknowledged and unspoken. In 1730, when Franklin was 24 years old and still building his printing business, he had publicly acknowledged his illegitimate son William and raised him in his household. William was born on February 22nd, 1730, but his mother's identity remains unknown. This act of public acknowledgement was, in its way, a measure of Franklin's growing confidence and status in Philadelphia. The boy was integrated into the family, educated in Philadelphia alongside his legitimate siblings, and given every advantage that Franklin's rising prosperity could provide. William grew into a capable young man. Beginning at about age 30, he studied law in London in the early 1760s during one of his father's missions to England. It was there, in 1762, that William himself married Elizabeth Downes, daughter of a planter from Barbados, in a ceremony conducted in London. The marriage represented a good match for an ambitious young man with connections to the colonies. The following year, in 1763, William Franklin was appointed as the last royal governor of New Jersey, a position of considerable honor and authority, one that reflected both his own merits and the influence of his father's standing in imperial circles. Yet William's path would diverge sharply from Benjamin's, with consequences that would tear at the fabric of their relationship. Before his marriage, however, William had fathered an illegitimate son of his own. William Temple Franklin was born on February 22nd, 1760, the same day and month as his father, a coincidental symmetry, but the boy's mother was never identified. Like his father before him, William placed the child in foster care and provided for his maintenance. The boy bore his father's name and would, in time, become a figure of some significance in his own right. The appointment to the governorship brought William into the upper ranks of colonial administration. As a royal governor, he represented the Crown's authority in New Jersey and became, by definition, a man of the establishment. This position suited his temperament and his ambitions. He had been educated in London, had married a planter's daughter, and now occupied a seat of power and privilege. It seemed that the son of the runaway apprentice, the son of a man who had arrived in Philadelphia with nothing, had ascended to the heights of colonial society. What neither father nor son could foresee, however, was that the very revolution that Benjamin would help to kindle would shatter William's career and create an irreconcilable breach between them. William Franklin, unlike his father, became a committed loyalist to the king. As the crisis between the colonies and Great Britain deepened, their fundamental disagreement about the American Revolutionary War would become absolute. Benjamin Franklin could never accept William's position. The difference was not merely political. It went to the heart of their understanding of justice, liberty, and the proper relationship between a people and their sovereign. What had been a difference of opinion between a father and son would crystallize into something far more severe. For now, in the early 1760s, these conflicts lay in the future. William Franklin was a rising man in the colonial administration, and Benjamin Franklin was at the height of his influence, moving between Philadelphia and London, defending American interests, advancing the cause of science and learning, and gradually coming to see that the relationship between the colonies and the mother country could not continue as it had been. The stage was being set, though the actors did not yet understand what roles they would be called upon to play. A printer's rise to wealth. A printer's rise to wealth, the honors that had accumulated around Benjamin Franklin in the years following his electrical discoveries, now attended him like patient servants. In 1762, Oxford University granted him an honorary doctorate, a distinction that altered how the world addressed him. No longer merely Mr. Franklin or Printer Franklin, he became Dr. Franklin, a title that reflected not a formal medical training or academic credential in the traditional sense, but rather the weight of his scientific accomplishments and the esteem in which natural philosophers held him. The letters after his name seemed to settle upon him with quiet inevitability, as if the academic world had finally caught up to what his experiments had already proven, that this man from Philadelphia possessed a mind of exceptional order. It was while living in London during 1768 that Franklin turned his considerable intellect toward the mechanics of written language itself. He developed what he termed a scheme for a new alphabet and a reformed mode of spelling, an elaborate system born of his conviction that the English alphabet carried within it unnecessary redundancies and lacked characters for certain sounds that demanded expression. He regarded 6 letters, C, J, Q, W, X, and Y as superfluous encumbrances, relics of linguistic accident rather than necessity. In their place, he proposed 6 new letters, carefully designed to capture sounds that he felt had been orphaned by the existing alphabet's incompleteness. It was characteristic of his mind, systematic, rational, convinced of the possibility of improvement through careful observation and logical reorganization. Yet this particular scheme, unlike his lightning rod or his electrical discoveries, would not survive the weight of custom and habit. The reformed alphabet never gained purchase in the world. It remained a beautiful thought, eventually abandoned even by its creator, who would lose interest in the project as other demands claimed his formidable attention. From the mid-1750s onward, Franklin had entered upon a pattern of life that would define his mature years, a rhythm of transatlantic crossing, of London serving as his principal residence and base of operations, from which he would venture forth into Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe, conducting the diplomatic and scientific business that had become as essential to him as breath. These were not the hasty journeys of a man in anxious pursuit, but rather the measured travels of one whose reputation preceded him, and whose presence was sought by the most distinguished minds of the age. In 1771, when Franklin undertook a series of journeys through England itself, he moved through a landscape of intellectual fellowship. He stayed with Joseph Priestley at Leeds, the chemist and clergyman whose own experimental work commanded respect. He went to Manchester to be the guest of Thomas Percival, and to Lichfield to visit with Erasmus Darwin, men of learning and influence in their own right. Yet it was to Scotland that Franklin's heart seemed particularly drawn. In 1759, he had travelled north with his son, and the experience had proven so restorative to his spirit that he would later report that those 6 weeks constituted 6 weeks of the densest happiness I have met with in any part of my life. This was not casual praise from a man accustomed to understatement. It speaks to something deeper, perhaps a recognition in the Scottish landscape or the Scottish temperament of qualities that resonated with his own nature. In 1771, he returned to renew those connections. He spent 5 days near Stirling as the guest of Lord Kames, whose legal and philosophical work had earned him a position of consequence. Still more significantly, he remained for 3 weeks in Edinburgh with David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher whose sceptical intelligence and elegant prose had influenced European thought. These were not social calls in the ordinary sense, but meetings of minds that recognized in each other kindred patterns of thought. Ireland presented a different dimension to his understanding of the empire, to which he still, in these years, felt some attachment. Franklin stayed with Lord Hillsborough, a figure of political power, yet the relationship was one tinged with the ambiguity that would increasingly characterize Franklin's observations of British colonial policy. He noted of Hillsborough with a sharpness that suggested his deepening disillusionment, that all the plausible behavior I have described is meant only, by patting and stroking the horse, to make him more patient, while the reins are drawn tighter and the spurs set deeper into his sides. It was language that revealed his growing conviction that the courtesies and assurances offered to the colonies masked a tightening grip. In Dublin, Franklin received an honour that distinguished him as a colonial American. He was invited to sit with the members of the Irish Parliament rather than to view proceedings from the gallery, making him the first American to receive such recognition. Yet what moved him most profoundly during his Irish travels was not the flattery of Parliament, but the visible destitution he witnessed throughout the kingdom. The poverty that afflicted Ireland struck him with particular force, for he recognized in it a cautionary tale. The same trade regulations and economic laws that constrained Ireland also governed the American colonies. He began to fear, with an apprehension that would only deepen in subsequent years, that America might be destined to follow Ireland down a path of economic diminishment if Parliament's restrictions continued unchecked. Continental Europe opened still further perspectives. In 1766, Franklin spent 2 months in German lands, a time that, though brief, planted seeds of intellectual connection that would bear fruit across the remainder of his life. He acknowledged a profound debt to Otto von Guericke, the German scientist, whose experimental work on electricity had contributed to the foundations upon which Franklin himself had built his own investigations. This recognition of intellectual heritage was characteristic of the man. He saw himself as part of a continuing human endeavor, each generation standing upon the shoulders of those who preceded it. The connections Franklin established with Germany would prove enduring and consequential. It was said that he would later co-author the first treaty of friendship between Prussia and America in 1785. A document that represented not merely political arrangement, but the crystallization of intellectual and cultural affinities that had developed across years of correspondence and mutual respect. Paris, when Franklin journeyed there in September 1767, presented itself as a city prepared to receive him as a conqueror of nature itself. He travelled with his customary companion, Sir John Pringle, 1st Baronet, a man whose own scientific standing and steady friendship had proven invaluable through years of collaboration. News of Franklin's electrical discoveries had preceded him to France, spreading through the salons and academic circles until his name had become almost mythical in the scientific community. The French understanding of electricity had been shaped substantially by reports of his experiments, and he arrived as a figure of romance and scientific achievement. He was introduced to influential scientists and politicians of the first rank, and even received audience with King Louis XV himself, a signal honor that testified to the esteem in which even the French monarchy held this colonial American scientist. Chapter 3. A Printer's Rise to Wealth. The honors that had accumulated around Franklin's name throughout his European years became tangible expressions of the esteem in which he was held. In 1762, Oxford University bestowed upon him an honorary doctorate, an acknowledgement that carried particular weight given the ancient institution's customary reserve in such matters. This distinction led to a subtle but significant shift in how he was addressed in society. The title Dr. Franklin began to appear with increasing frequency in correspondence and public acknowledgement, transforming the printer scientist into a figure of unambiguous academic standing. The freedom of the borough of St. Andrews had similarly marked his acceptance into the fabric of Scottish intellectual life, and these formal recognitions served as reminders that his contributions to human knowledge transcended the boundaries of nationality and provincial origin. The intellectual restlessness that had always characterized Franklin's mind found expression in new directions during his years in London. In 1768, while continuing his scientific investigations and diplomatic work, he turned his attention to the fundamentals of written communication itself. He developed what he called a scheme for a new alphabet and a reformed mode of spelling, an undertaking that reflected his belief that even the tools of language could be improved through rational analysis and systematic reform. This reformed alphabet represented an ambitious rethinking of English orthography. Franklin regarded 6 letters as redundant to the proper representation of English sounds. The letters C, J, Q, W, X, and Y. In their place, he proposed 6 new letters designed to represent sounds that he believed lacked adequate written expression. It was a project of considerable intellectual ambition, yet it failed to gain traction beyond the circle of his immediate associates. The alphabet never caught on, and after some years of quiet advocacy for his system, Franklin gradually lost interest in the enterprise. Recognizing perhaps that reform of language itself could not proceed through the efforts of even the most determined individual, his movements across the British Isles and the continent during the 1750s and 1760s reveal a man who had become a fixture in the intellectual and scientific networks of the age. From the mid-1750s onward through the mid-1770s, Franklin maintained London as his base. But this residence served primarily as a launching point for more extensive journeys. In 1771, he undertook a series of short journeys through different parts of England, visiting Joseph Priestley at Leeds, where he encountered the mind of a man whose own investigations into electricity and gases would prove groundbreaking. In Manchester, he stayed with Thomas Percival, and near Lichfield, he was received by Erasmus Darwin, a physician and natural philosopher whose curiosity about the mechanisms of life anticipated questions that would occupy naturalists for generations to come. These were not casual visits, but rather pilgrimages to the homes of men whose work engaged Franklin's own scientific preoccupations. His journey into Scotland proved even more consequential for his spirit. In 1771, he spent 5 days near Stirling as the guest of Lord Kames, but it was his extended stay in Edinburgh that produced the most profound emotional satisfaction. He remained there for 3 weeks with David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher whose writings on human nature and causation had influenced Franklin's own thinking about the natural world. This visit to Scotland had been anticipated by an earlier journey in 1759, when Franklin travelled there with his son, and later reported an assessment of his experience that revealed the depth of his capacity for happiness. He declared that his 6 weeks in Scotland constituted 6 weeks of the densest happiness I have met with in any part of my life. This statement, made with characteristic honesty about his own inner experience, suggests that the companionship of great minds, the beauty of the Scottish landscape, and the intellectual freedom he enjoyed during that period had touched something deep within him. His time in Ireland introduced him to a different sort of lesson, one rooted in economic hardship and political constraint rather than intellectual pleasure. He stayed with Lord Hillsborough, a figure toward whom Franklin's judgment proved decidedly cool. In his assessment, Hillsborough's courteous behaviour was merely a stratagem, meant only by patting and stroking the horse to make him more patient while the reins are drawn tighter and the spurs set deeper into his sides. This vivid metaphor captured Franklin's perception of the man's true intent beneath his surface politeness. While in Dublin, he received an honour that distinguished him as an American. He was invited to sit with the members of the Irish Parliament rather than in the gallery, making him the first American to receive such recognition. Yet the satisfaction of this distinction was overshadowed by what he witnessed of Irish conditions. As he travelled through the Kingdom of Ireland, he was deeply moved by the level of poverty he encountered among the Irish people. The economic hardship he observed was not accidental, but systematic, the result of the same trade regulations and laws that governed the 13 colonies. This recognition struck Franklin with particular force because he saw in Ireland's poverty a warning of what might befall America. He feared that the American colonies, should the regulations and laws continue to apply to them indefinitely, could eventually descend to the same level of economic desperation that had impoverished Ireland. His engagement with German intellectual life, though limited in direct personal contact, extended across the full arc of his career. In 1766, he spent 2 months in German lands, time that allowed him to deepen connections that would remain important throughout his life. Franklin acknowledged a debt of gratitude to Otto von Guericke, the German scientist whose early studies of electricity had opened pathways that Franklin himself would explore with such productive vigor. The intellectual filiation that connected Guericke's 17th century investigations to Franklin's 18th century experiments spoke to the cumulative nature of scientific progress. Each generation building upon the careful work of those who preceded them. This recognition of indebtedness would culminate, much later, in an achievement of considerable diplomatic importance. In 1785, Franklin would co-author the first Treaty of Friendship between Prussia and America, a document that represented not merely political arrangement, but the crystallization of intellectual and cultural affinities that had developed across years of correspondence and mutual respect between American and Prussian leaders. The visit to Paris in September 1767 marked a culmination of sorts in Franklin's years of European travel and scientific recognition. He journeyed there with Sir John Pringle, 1st Baronet, his customary travelling companion, whose own scientific standing and steady friendship had proven invaluable through years of close collaboration. News of Franklin's electrical discoveries had preceded him to France, spreading through the salons and academic circles with the force of intellectual fashion until his name had become almost mythical in the scientific community of Paris. The French understanding of electricity had been shaped substantially by reports and descriptions of his experiments, filtered through translations and correspondence, until he arrived as a figure of genuine romance and manifest scientific achievement. The reception he received reflected this reputation. He was introduced to influential scientists and politicians of the first rank, and he even obtained audience with King Louis XV himself, a signal honor that testified in unmistakable fashion to the esteem in which even the French monarchy held this colonial American scientist. Such recognition from the person of the French king represented an accolade that placed Franklin definitively among the great men of his age, a status that no amount of merely academic honor could have conveyed with such public clarity. Lightning, Learning, and Liberty. Chapter 4. Lightning, Learning, and Liberty. The electricity that occupied Franklin's mind during these years of recognition and honor was not merely the subject of philosophical discourse in the salons of Paris, nor was it confined to the leather-bound pages of scientific journals that circulated through the academies of Europe. It was a force that seemed to pulse through nature itself, visible in the sky during storms, terrible and beautiful, and Franklin found himself drawn to understand it not as a curiosity to be catalogued, but as a phenomenon that might yield its secrets to careful observation and bold experimentation. The nature of electrical discharge had troubled natural philosophers for centuries, appearing now as a laboratory phenomenon when glass rods were rubbed with fur or silk, now as the devastating lightning that split trees and brought fire to buildings and death to living creatures. That these two appearances might be one and the same thing. This was a proposition that required proof, and Franklin resolved to provide it. The work with electricity had not been without its personal costs. In the course of his investigations, pursuing the practical applications of his discoveries, Franklin had subjected himself to shocks that left him shaken and humbled. He recounted one experiment with Leyden jars, those remarkable vessels that could store electrical charge with remarkable potency, during which he received a shock so violent that numbness spread through his arms and lingered through the evening hours. The experience brought him to record, with a candor that spoke to his scientific honesty, that he was ashamed to have been guilty of so notorious a blunder. Yet such moments of personal discomfort seemed only to sharpen his determination to understand the phenomenon more completely, for he could not abandon work that promised such significant advancement of human knowledge, even when it carried the risk of bodily harm. Parallel to his experimental investigations, Franklin had turned his mind briefly to the question of whether electrical force might be applied in service to human health and medical restoration. He investigated electrotherapy, exploring the use of the electric bath as a means of treating various afflictions. This work, though ultimately not his primary focus, contributed substantially to making the field widely known among the medical practitioners and natural philosophers of his time. The mere fact that a man of Franklin's standing had devoted attention to such applications lent them a credibility and a fashionability that they might not otherwise have commanded. His investigations, conducted with the same rigorous attention to method that characterized all his scientific work, helped establish electrotherapy as a field worthy of serious consideration, even if the ultimate efficacy of such treatments would prove to be limited. The recognition that came to Franklin for his electrical discoveries arrived with remarkable formality and weight. In 1753, scarcely a year after his most important experiments had been conducted and disseminated, the Royal Society of London awarded him the Copley Medal, an honour that represented the highest acknowledgement the scientific community could bestow upon an individual investigator. This award did not merely gratify his vanity, though he was surely not insensible to the honour, rather. It represented a formal declaration that he belonged among the foremost natural philosophers of the age. 3 years after receiving this medal, in 1756, Franklin achieved a distinction that was remarkable for any man of his era, but particularly extraordinary for a colonist from America. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society itself. Few Americans of the 18th century had achieved this membership, and fewer still had done so while living in the colonies, rather than having relocated permanently to England. This election placed him in a category of scientific prominence that transcended the boundaries of nationality and provincial origin, marking him as a man whose contributions to the advancement of learning were recognized by the most authoritative institutions of the age. The magnitude of the recognition extended even into the realm of scientific nomenclature itself. The fundamental unit of electric charge would eventually bear his name, a permanence of honor that outlasted the particular experiments that had earned it. 1 Franklin, as the unit would come to be called, equal to 1 stat coulomb, would be employed by scientists for centuries to come. A constant reminder of the contributions that the Philadelphia printer had made to humanity's understanding of natural forces. Yet, recognition was not the only consequence of his work. When Harvard University found itself in need of new apparatus for the investigation of electrical phenomena, the loss occurring when a fire destroyed the original collection housed in Harvard Hall in 1764. It was Franklin to whom the university turned for guidance. His advice in the acquisition of new laboratory instruments, based upon the latest developments in the field and the lessons he had learned through his own patient investigations, helped the institution re-establish its capacity for electrical research. The collection that resulted from his counsel would eventually become a treasure of scientific history, preserved in the Harvard collection of historical scientific instruments and displayed for later generations to contemplate the instruments through which their ancestors had begun to pierce the veil that shrouded nature's operations. But it was the question of lightning itself, that most dramatic and dangerous manifestation of electrical force, that captured Franklin's imagination most intensely, and that would prove to be his most consequential contribution to the safety and welfare of ordinary people. Lightning was not a laboratory phenomenon that could be studied at leisure and with careful precautions. It was a force that descended from the clouds with terrible swiftness and often lethal consequence. If lightning were indeed electricity, as Franklin had come to believe, then perhaps the properties of electricity that he had discovered in his laboratory might be applied to defend buildings and the people within them from this devastating natural scourge. This was not merely a question of scientific interest, it was a matter of profound practical importance. The proposal that Franklin formulated was elegant in its simplicity and bold in its conception. He would fly a kite during a storm and attempt to draw electrical charge from the clouds themselves. This experiment, if successful, would prove that the electricity resident in the heavens was of the same fundamental nature as the electricity that he could generate and manipulate in the laboratory. The logic was compelling and the potential revelation momentous, but the dangers were equally apparent. Lightning was not a force that could be negotiated with or tamed through mere good intentions. It was capable of striking with the speed of thought and with consequences that were invariably fatal to any living creature, so unfortunate as to be in its path. The chronology of events surrounding this famous experiment reveals a fascinating story of parallel investigations undertaken across the Atlantic. On May 10th, 1752, a French scientist named Thomas Francois Dalibard, working with knowledge of Franklin's proposal, conducted an experiment using not a kite but an iron rod 40 feet in height, erected vertically to receive the electrical discharge from the clouds. From this rod, Dalibard succeeded in extracting electrical sparks, proving that the cloud possessed electrical charge that could be drawn forth and collected. The experiment was successful and demonstrated the principle that Franklin had proposed, though conducted by another hand and through a different method. It was on June 15th, 1752, in Philadelphia, that Franklin himself undertook the famous kite experiment that would become the stuff of legend and popular imagination, though the records are not entirely precise about the date and the actual conduct of the affair. The experiment, as Franklin described it in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, on October 19th, 1752, involved flying a kite made of silk during a thunderstorm, with a wire extending from the kite to a key that was held by the experimenter. As rain wet the kite string, making it conductive, electrical charge from the clouds would descend through the wire and could be observed at the key, manifesting itself in ways that were unmistakable and alarming. The experiment was conducted with a care and prudence that was not always appreciated in the romantic retellings that would follow in later years and centuries. Franklin took pains to stand upon an insulator, and he sheltered himself beneath a roof or shed to keep himself dry, measures that were essential to prevent the transmission of electrical charge through his body to the ground. He did not, contrary to the popular imagining, stand boldly in the storm, waiting to be struck by lightning, for such recklessness would have resulted only in certain death, as happened to others who undertook similar experiments with less caution. When he described the experiment to the scientific community, Franklin demonstrated the principle with remarkable clarity. He wrote, in a letter sent to England in October 1752, with directions for repeating the experiment, when rain has wet the kite twine so that it can conduct the electric fire freely, you will find it streams out plentifully from the key at the approach of your knuckle, and with this key a feel, or leaden jar, may be charged, and from electric fire thus obtained spirits may be kindled, and all other electric experiments performed, which are usually done by the help of a rubber glass globe or tube, and therefore the sameness of the electrical matter with that of lightning completely demonstrated. The experiments Franklin conducted during these years of intensive inquiry into electrical phenomena took their toll upon his person. In the course of his investigations, he was jolted by a pair of leaden jars, those glass vessels lined with foil and filled with electrical charge, resulting in a numbness that settled into his arms and persisted through the evening. The experience prompted a measure of self-reflection, and he recorded his embarrassment at what he termed so notorious a blunder. Acknowledging both the dangers inherent in such work and the necessity of caution when handling the invisible forces he sought to understand. Beyond the kite experiment itself, Franklin's curiosity about electricity extended into practical applications that might benefit human health and welfare. He devoted some attention to electrotherapy, experimenting with the use of what was called the electric bath, a therapeutic application of electrical current. This exploratory work, modest though it was in its scope, helped to bring the field of electrotherapy into wider notice and consideration. The scientific establishment of his time took considerable notice of his achievements in recognition of his contributions to the understanding of electricity and its properties. The Royal Society of London awarded him the Copley Medal in 1753, a distinction of great prestige. 3 years later, in 1756, he achieved an honor that was yet more remarkable for a colonial American of his era. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society itself, placing him among a very small number of 18th century colonists to receive such recognition from the foremost scientific body of the English-speaking world. The mark of his influence upon science was further perpetuated in the nomenclature of electrical measurement. The unit of electric charge in the CG system was named in his honor, 1 Franklin, abbreviated FER, equals 1 stack coulomb, a lasting tribute to his pioneering investigations. As his scientific reputation grew, Franklin's practical wisdom was sought by institutions seeking to advance their own scholarly pursuits. Harvard University, having suffered the complete loss of its original electrical laboratory apparatus in a devastating fire that consumed Harvard Hall in 1764, turned to Franklin for counsel in acquiring new instruments and equipment. The collection that Franklin helped the university assemble became a foundation for what later developed into the Harvard collection of historical scientific instruments. These pieces, which had once been instruments of discovery in Franklin's own time, eventually became historical artifacts themselves, preserved and displayed for public appreciation in Harvard's Science Center, where they remain accessible to those who wish to see the tools of 18th century natural philosophy. The theoretical understanding that Franklin had established through the kite experiment found its most practical expression in an invention of considerable utility and importance, the lightning rod. Having proved that lightning was indeed electrical in nature, Franklin turned his mind to the question of how buildings and the people within them might be protected from the destructive force of lightning strikes. His reasoning proceeded from observations about the behavior of electrical charge. He believed, based on his experimental work, that conductors terminating in sharp points, rather than blunt or rounded ends, could discharge electrical energy silently, and could do so at a distance significantly greater than smooth conductors. This insight led him to propose a simple but elegant solution to a problem that had troubled humanity since time immemorial. Franklin envisioned upright rods of iron, made sharp as a needle and gilt to prevent rusting, positioned on the highest points of buildings, with conductors running down the exterior walls into the ground. He posed a question that reflected the logic of his proposal. Would not these pointed rods probably draw the electrical fire silently out of a cloud before it came nigh enough to strike, and thereby secure us from that most sudden and terrible mischief? The elegance of the idea lay in its preventive quality. Rather than waiting for lightning to strike and then trying to dissipate its destructive energy, the pointed rod would, he theorized, draw off the electrical charge harmlessly and gradually, before it could accumulate to the point of causing a violent discharge. To test his theory, Franklin conducted a series of experiments on his own residence, putting his own home and family at some risk in service of the advancement of knowledge and human safety. Satisfied with the results of these trials, he moved forward with installing lightning rods on public buildings of significance. The Academy of Philadelphia, which would later become the University of Pennsylvania, received Franklin's protection in 1752, as did the Pennsylvania State House, the very building that would later become known as Independence Hall, and the site where the Declaration of Independence would be proclaimed 2 decades hence. These installations represented an early large-scale application of electrical theory to human benefit, a translation of scientific knowledge into practical protection against natural forces. The association between Franklin and kites, so vividly established through the lightning experiment, overshadowed in the minds of most people another, quite different application to which he put these simple devices. Franklin demonstrated that kites could be harnessed to pull human bodies and even ships across waterways, a use that fascinated other natural philosophers and inventors of his time. George Pocock, who would later write a treatise entitled A Treatise on the Aeropleutic Art, or Navigation in the Air by Means of Kites or Buoyant Sails, explicitly acknowledged his inspiration drawn from observing Franklin's traction of his own body by means of kite power across a body of water. This aspect of Franklin's experimentation has remained less celebrated in popular memory than his dramatic lightning experiments, yet it spoke to his creative willingness to find novel applications for the forces of nature in service to human convenience and progress. Diplomat and the Course of Nations. Diplomat and the Course of Nations. These installations represented an early large-scale application of electrical theory to human benefit, a translation of scientific knowledge into practical protection against natural forces. The association between Franklin and kites, so vividly established through the lightning experiment, overshadowed in the minds of most people another, quite different application to which he put these simple devices. Franklin demonstrated that kites could be harnessed to pull human bodies and even ships across waterways, a use that fascinated other natural philosophers and inventors of his time. George Pocock, who would later write a treatise entitled A Treatise on the Aeropleutic Art, or Navigation in the Air by Means of Kites or Buoyant Sails, explicitly acknowledged his inspiration drawn from observing Franklin's traction of his own body by means of kite power across a body of water. This aspect of Franklin's experimentation has remained less celebrated in popular memory than his dramatic lightning experiments, yet it spoke to his creative willingness to find novel applications for the forces of nature in service to human convenience and progress. But the kite, whether directing electricity safely toward Earth or drawing a man across the water's surface, was merely one expression of a mind that had grown expansive in its middle years. a mind that turned increasingly toward questions not only of natural philosophy, but of moral philosophy, of governance, and of the proper ordering of human society. As Franklin moved through his later decades, the practical tradesman and experimental scientist became something more, a public figure whose influence extended into the realm of ideas that shaped nations. His diplomatic work, undertaken first in London and later in Paris, carried with it the weight of these accumulated convictions, these tested virtues, these principles distilled through long years of living and observing. The religious temperament that had always animated Franklin, even as it evolved and transformed, provided a steady foundation for his public work. Though he had abandoned the orthodoxies of his Puritan upbringing in his youth, declaring himself in those early years a thorough deist, guided by reason and nature rather than doctrine, he retained throughout his life something essential from that austere tradition. It was not belief in creeds or catechisms that endured, but rather the ethical framework itself, the conviction that God's work on earth was best accomplished through human goodness, industry, and charitable action. The doing of good to man, this remained constant. In his autobiography, written in his later years, he reflected on the principles that had sustained him. I never doubted, for instance, the existence of the deity, that he made the world and governed it by his providence, that the most acceptable service of God was the doing good to man, that our souls are immortal, and that all crime will be punished and virtue rewarded, either here or hereafter. These were convictions he had maintained, even when, as a young man, he had ceased to attend church, even when he had rejected the resurrection of Christ and many of the doctrines that Christians held sacred. Yet Franklin's religious evolution was not a simple trajectory from belief to skepticism. Rather, it was a constant recalibration, a movement through various philosophical positions, each one tested against the measure of human welfare and moral conduct. In his middle years, he had come to understand that pure deism, though intellectually satisfying, lacked the practical power to govern human behavior as effectively as organized religion did. He had observed, with some disillusionment, the moral decline in himself and in certain friends to whom he had introduced deist principles in London. The abstract truths of reason, it seemed, were insufficient to constrain human appetite and vice. What was needed was something that combined reason with the institutional force of community and tradition. A religion stripped of its dogmatic assertions, but retaining its moral authority. This evolution in his thinking found expression in what might be called, in his later life, a doctrineless Christianity, a reverence for the moral teachings of Jesus without adherence to supernatural claims about his nature. As he approached the very end of his days, in 1790, with death plainly approaching, he would write to Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale University, expressing his mature position on these matters with the calm certainty of a man who no longer felt compelled to argue points of theology. The system of morals taught by Jesus, he declared, was the best the world had ever seen, or was likely to see. Yet he harbored doubts about the divinity of Christ, questions he confessed he had never deeply studied, and now saw no need to examine closely, given that he expected soon to know the truth with less trouble. His faith in those final months rested not on doctrine, but on an observation of how the world itself seemed to operate. The unbelievers did not appear to be marked by divine displeasure in any observable way, which suggested to him that God was more concerned with the practical effects of belief, its capacity to make people virtuous, than with the metaphysical correctness of the creed itself. What remained constant throughout all these shifts was his passion for virtue, as he himself termed it, a phrase that captured something of the intensity with which he pursued not personal holiness, but public good. The Puritan values of his childhood, though secularized and rationalized, never truly left him. Industry, thrift, honesty, temperance, charity, community spirit, these were not merely individual virtues, but the building blocks of a functioning society. And beyond these personal qualities lay something broader still, an egalitarian conviction that a man's true worth lay not in his station or ancestry, but in his moral behavior, a radical idea in an era when hierarchy was still regarded as natural and necessary. This conviction shaped how Franklin moved through the world of power and diplomacy. He came to believe deeply in religious tolerance, a position that was itself revolutionary in his time. In Philadelphia, where he had built his fortune and established his printing business, he had witnessed the construction of new places of worship, buildings rising to house Anglicans, Presbyterians, Quakers, and others. He contributed to the building of these structures, regardless of the sect that would worship within them. When Whitefield's followers in Philadelphia needed a large hall where any preacher of any faith could speak, Franklin supported the creation of such a space. This was not merely indifference to religion, but an active commitment to the principle that conscience could not be coerced, that truth in religious matters must persuade through its own force rather than through the power of civil authority. He had even composed a parable to this effect, an apocryphal chapter of Genesis in which God himself instructs Abraham in the duty of tolerance toward those who worship differently. And later, when he found himself in London in 1774, now in his late 60s, serving his country in diplomatic capacity, he attended what records suggest was a significant moment in the history of English religious freedom, the inaugural session of the Essex Street Chapel, where Theophilus Lindsay had gathered together the first avowedly Unitarian congregation in England. This was a dangerous business. The denial of the Trinity remained illegal, would remain so until 1813. Yet Franklin, now a man of international standing and influence, was present at this assertion of conscience against law. His writings on these themes, scattered through decades of publications and private letters, reveal a mind deeply concerned with the question of how human beings should live together in society. He insisted that freedom of speech was foundational to all liberty, that in those wretched countries where a man cannot call his tongue his own, he can scarce call anything his own. Without freedom of thought, there could be no wisdom. Without freedom of speech, there could be no public liberty. These were not abstract principles for Franklin, but practical necessities for a functioning commonwealth. He had seen enough of human nature, through his printing business and his civic work, to understand that truth required the constant testing that comes through open debate and the free exchange of ideas. Yet Franklin's vision of the good society was not anarchic or libertarian in a modern sense. It was, rather, ordered around a set of carefully cultivated personal virtues that he believed would, if practiced widely, create the conditions for social harmony and mutual flourishing. At the age of 20, records suggest he had formulated a plan, a disciplined program of self-improvement that he would continue in some form for the remainder of his long life. These 13 virtues, temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility, were not presented as counsel to others, but as a personal project, a kind of moral architecture by which one man might construct a better character and thereby contribute however modestly, to the improvement of the whole. Chapter 5, what Franklin understood intuitively, and what his virtues program made explicit, was that personal discipline and moral consistency were not merely individual concerns, but civic ones. A man who practiced temperance, industry, and frugality contributed to the stability of his community in ways both direct and indirect. He was less likely to become a burden on public resources, more likely to invest in public goods, and more inclined to see his own interests as bound up with those around him. This was not a naive faith in human nature, but a pragmatic recognition of how societies actually function. When enough individuals cultivate such habits, the entire social fabric becomes stronger and more resilient. Franklin's approach to religion, though it evolved considerably over his long life, reflected this same integration of personal conviction with public responsibility. As a young man, he had adopted deism, that product of enlightenment, thought which held that God's truths could be discerned through nature and reason alone, independent of revelation or church authority. He had even published a pamphlet in 1725, arguing against necessity and in favor of divine benevolence, though he later came to regard this work with some embarrassment. Yet deism, for all its rational appeal, presented him with a problem he could not ignore. When two friends whom he had persuaded toward deistic thinking experienced what he perceived as a moral decline, Franklin began to reconsider. Deism might be philosophically sound, but it appeared to lack the practical efficacy of organized religion in promoting personal virtue and moral. This realization did not drive him back into orthodox Christianity, nor did it compromise his intellectual independence. Rather, it led him toward a position that became increasingly distinctive over the decades. He came to believe that the true essence of religion lay not in doctrinal precision or theological disputation, but in the moral conduct it fostered and the social harmony it promoted. As he himself wrote, reflecting on what constituted genuine religiosity, the most acceptable service of God was nothing less than the doing of good to man. This principle, simple, almost austere in its directness, became the lens through which he viewed all questions of faith and practice. When he ceased his regular attendance at church, a decision that caused some gossip in Philadelphia, Franklin made clear in his autobiography that this represented no abandonment of religious principle. He had never doubted the existence of deity, nor had he wavered in his conviction that the soul was immortal and that virtue would ultimately be rewarded while crime would be punished, whether in this life or the next. What he rejected was not religion itself, but rather the elaborate apparatus of doctrine and dogma that he saw as obscuring rather than clarifying the fundamental truth. Sunday, for him, became a studying day, a time to reflect upon moral and philosophical matters rather than to submit passively to the pronouncements of others. Yet for all his independence of mind, Franklin retained throughout his life the values with which he had been raised in a Puritan household. The stress on virtue, on industry, on sobriety and thrift, on the moral transformation of character, these were not external impositions, but the deepest convictions of his youth, and they remained so to the end. In this respect, he embodied something of great consequence for the American experiment, the possibility of maintaining the ethical substance of a religious tradition while releasing oneself from its doctrinal constraints. The Puritan virtues that had been developed in the context of Christian theology could, he believed, stand on their own as a guide to human conduct and social welfare. Franklin's later religious position, if one can call it that, was increasingly what his contemporaries and subsequent scholars have termed generic religion. or what Thomas Kidd characterizes as doctrineless, moralized Christianity. He prayed to powerful goodness and referred to God as the infinite. In 1774, while living in London, he attended the inaugural session of the Essex Street Chapel, where Theophilus Lindsay gathered the first avowedly Unitarian congregation in England, a gathering that was itself somewhat politically risky, as denial of the Trinity remained technically illegal. This attendance, though perhaps surprising for one of his years and stature, reflected his deep commitment to religious tolerance and his fascination with those who sought to strip away doctrinal complexity in pursuit of ethical simplicity. His respect and support for all churches and denominations became legendary in Philadelphia. He contributed his mite toward the building of new places of worship, regardless of sect, never refusing to assist in the construction of a chapel or meeting house. He had a gift for religious pluralism, unusual even for the more cosmopolitan thinkers of his age. When the Great Awakening swept through the colonies, with preachers like George Whitefield rousing crowds to evangelical fervor, Franklin did not himself embrace Whitefield's theology, yet he recognized in the movement something valuable and important. He admired Whitefield's insistence that the true worship of God lay in the performance of good works. When opportunity came, he published Whitefield's sermons and journals, earning considerable money while simultaneously lending his commercial success to the cause of evangelical revival. John Adams, observing Franklin's religious stance from close proximity, made a penetrating remark about his friend's ability to embody multiple theological perspectives simultaneously. The Catholics, Adams noted, thought Franklin almost a Catholic. The Church of England claimed him as one of theirs. Presbyterians considered him half a Presbyterian, and the Friends believed him a wet Quaker. Adams himself, viewing the matter with characteristic bluntness, concluded that Franklin best fitted among the atheists, deists, and libertines, though this judgment perhaps says more about Adams's own orthodoxy than about Franklin's actual convictions. Late in his life, when Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale University, pressed him directly on his views concerning Jesus Christ, Franklin offered a response that captures his mature position with admirable precision. He believed the system of morals taught by Jesus, and the religion as Jesus had left it, to be the best the world had ever seen or was likely to see. Yet he held doubts about the divinity of Christ, though he confessed that he had never studied the question rigorously and did not think it needful to do so now, at his advanced age, when he expected soon to know the truth directly. He saw no harm, however, in the belief in Christ's divinity, if it had the beneficial consequence of making his moral teachings more respected and better observed. God, he reflected, did not seem to mark unbelievers with any particular displeasure in the governance of the world. This last observation reveals much about Franklin's deepest convictions. He was not primarily concerned with what God demanded of human belief, but rather with what God seemed to tolerate and promote in the observable workings of the world. If a belief produced good effects, if it inclined people toward virtue and mutual care, then it had justified itself pragmatically, whatever its metaphysical standing might be. Conversely, if orthodoxy produced sectarian violence or moral hypocrisy, then its truth claims meant little. Franklin wrote a parable against persecution, an apocryphal 51st chapter of Genesis, in which God teaches Abraham the duty of tolerance toward those of different faiths. This composition, though whimsical in form, expressed something Franklin held with utmost seriousness. His belief in the separation of religion and civil government flowed logically from these convictions. When a religion was good, he wrote. It would support itself without help from the state. If it could not support itself, if its professors were obliged to call upon civil power for assistance. This seemed to him a sure sign of its being fundamentally weak or corrupt. Good religion, like good government, should rest on the willing consent of those who practiced it, not upon coercion or the machinery of the state. The First Americans Enduring Light. Chapter 6. The first Americans enduring light, the mind that had questioned so much during life, the efficacy of old remedies, the necessity of established creeds, the limits of human knowledge, was now itself subject to the reckoning of time. As Benjamin Franklin entered his final decades, the practical wisdom that had guided him through printing houses and electrical experiments, through the smoky rooms of diplomacy and the careful design of civic institutions, turned toward a different sort of problem, the question of what endures after a man has lived, not what he leaves behind in the immediate aftermath of his death, but what survives the forgetting, what continues to labor in the world long after his own hands have ceased their work. In the year 1736, Franklin had suffered a loss that visited upon him a particular and lasting anguish. One of his sons, a fine boy of 4 years old, had been taken by the smallpox in the common way. The child had fallen ill before Franklin and his wife could arrange for inoculation, that safer method by which the disease might be introduced to the body in a controlled manner, conferring protection without the mortal threat of the natural infection. Franklin would carry the weight of this decision, or rather this postponement of decision, for the remainder of his life. In the privacy of his autobiography, written when he was an old man, he set down his regret with a candor that spoke to something deeper than mere parental sorrow. "I long regretted bitterly, and still regret," he wrote, his aged hand moving across the page, "that I had not given it to him by inoculation." The specificity of his grief, the refusal to let the moment pass without examination, revealed a mind incapable of accepting tragedy as mere misfortune. Even in his recounting of this intimate loss, there was purpose, he wrote, as he had always written, not for himself alone, but for others. This I mention for the sake of parents who omit that operation, on the supposition that they should never forgive themselves if a child died under it. My example, showing that the regret may be the same either way, and that, therefore, the safer should be chosen. This was the voice of a man who had learned through irreplaceable suffering that knowledge, once grasped, carried an obligation to pass it onward. The loss of his son had taught him a lesson about human nature and parental fear that no theoretical consideration could have supplied. Parents, he understood, often shrank from the small and measured risk of inoculation because they could not bear the thought that their own hand might administer the poison that took the child. But Franklin's bitter experience showed that inaction itself could produce the same devastation, and that therefore, the safer course must be chosen. The logical progression was simple, almost mathematical, yet it was rooted in blood and tears. As the years accumulated upon him, Franklin's mind continued to contemplate the trajectory of human knowledge and human capability. In the year 1780, when he had reached the age of 74 and had lived through the birth pangs of a new nation, he committed to paper, in a letter to his friend Joseph Priestley, a vision of the future that seemed to exceed the bounds of reasonable speculation. And yet, it was not wild fancy, but rather the natural extrapolation of a man who had witnessed, in his own lifetime, transformations that would have seemed impossible to his younger self. The rapid progress true science now makes, he wrote, occasions my regretting sometimes that I was born so soon. There was in this sentiment a poignant irony. A man who had lived so actively, who had shaped so much of the world around him, found himself wishing for a longer life in a future age, when the accumulating knowledge of humanity might have advanced even further. What marvels did Franklin imagine stretching before humanity in the centuries to come? He gave voice to dreams that seemed to belong more to allegory than to the realm of serious speculation. It is impossible to imagine, he told Priestley, the height to which may be carried, in 1,000 years, the power of man over matter. In that vast span of time, 1,000 years hence, he envisioned the conquest not merely of disease, but of the very condition that had bound all living creatures since the beginning of time. All diseases may by sure means be prevented or cured, not excepting even that of old age, and our lives lengthened at pleasure even beyond the antediluvian standard. The antediluvian standard referred to those mythic ages before the flood, when the patriarchs had lived for centuries, when Methuselah had seen nearly 1,000 years pass. Franklin imagined a future science so triumphant that it might restore to humanity a span of years that only legend now remembered. Yet this vision was not born of mere dreaming. Franklin grounded his speculation in the observable facts of progress. Agriculture might shed its laborious methods and double its produce. The very laws of nature that bound matter to the earth might be overcome. Perhaps humanity might learn, in those distant centuries, to deprive large masses of their gravity and give them absolute levity for the sake of easy transport. The words seemed almost whimsical when set beside the earnest scientific endeavor of his own time. Yet they revealed a mind still capable, at an advanced age, of following reason into territories that conventional wisdom had abandoned. Not content with imagining the distant future, Franklin had once before entertained a more intimate fantasy of temporal escape. It is said that in the year 1773, he had wished it were possible to invent a method of embalming drowned persons in such a manner that they might be recalled to life at any period, however distant. The desire was not born of morbid curiosity or a desperate hope to cheat death itself, but rather from an ardent wish to observe the state of America in the century that would follow his own time. Here was a man so absorbed in the question of what America might become, so invested in the experiment of a new nation, that he fantasized about preserving himself, as one might preserve a seed or a specimen, so that he might awaken in the future and see with his own eyes how the great work had progressed. The impulse revealed the deepest nature of his patriotism, not a blind attachment to what already existed, but a hunger to witness the unfolding of possibility. These glimpses into Franklin's imagination in his later years showed a mind still restless, still reaching beyond the boundaries of the present moment. Yet even as he contemplated futures he would not see, he was engaged in the practical work of leaving something behind that might endure long after his death. His deepest convictions about the nature of useful knowledge, about the cultivation of virtue, about the establishment of institutions that might serve the public good, these he attempted to encode not merely in writings that might be read and forgotten, but in structures that would work in silence, accruing benefit across generations, long after the man himself had passed into history. The weight of personal tragedy had taught Franklin early the consequences of hesitation in matters of health and prevention. In his autobiography, he recorded with enduring sorrow the loss of one of his sons, a boy of 4 years old, who died of smallpox in 1736, contracted in the common way. Franklin had delayed having the child inoculated, waiting until the boy recovered from another illness before subjecting him to the procedure. Yet that recovery never came to pass, and the disease took him instead. Decades later, the memory remained tender enough that Franklin felt compelled to set down his regret for posterity. Writing with the careful precision of a man who understood the gravity of what he was saying, he had long regretted bitterly, and still regretted, that he had not given the infection to his son by inoculation. He recognized that his grief might serve a purpose beyond his own heart, however, and he offered his example to other parents who hesitated before the procedure, fearing that they could never forgive themselves should a child die under the inoculation itself. Franklin's testimony was an act of quiet witness. The regret may be the same either way, he wrote, and that therefore the safer method should be chosen. In these words lay the accumulated wisdom of loss, transformed into guidance that might spare others the particular torment of wondering whether their own caution had been the instrument of their child's death. Such reflections on the fragility of life and the importance of prevention seemed only to deepen Franklin's conviction that the future held extraordinary possibilities for the alleviation of human suffering. In a letter written to Joseph Priestley on the 8th of February in 1780, when Franklin had reached the advanced age of 74, he allowed himself to indulge in speculation about what science and human ingenuity might yet accomplish. He imagined that in the years to come, all diseases might by sure means be prevented or cured, and he included in this vision even that ancient enemy, old age itself. Our lives, he suggested to Priestley, might be lengthened at pleasure, extended beyond even the antediluvian standard, that immense span of years attributed to the patriarchs of old. It was a vision both scientific and almost mythic in its scope, born from a mind that had spent a lifetime observing how rapidly the true sciences now made their progress. The rapidity of this advancement occasioned in Franklin, even at his advanced age, a singular regret. He found himself wishing, sometimes, that he had been born later, that he might have lived to witness the full flowering of what human knowledge might achieve. The imagination could scarcely grasp the height to which the power of man over matter might be carried in the course of 1,000 years. He contemplated possibilities that seemed to belong more to the realm of fancy than to practical science, yet he articulated them with the seriousness of one who had made it his life's work to understand what might be made real. Perhaps mankind would learn to deprive large masses of their gravity and give them absolute levity for the sake of easy transport. Agriculture might diminish its labor and double its produce, feeding populations grown vast and numerous. The very texture of human civilization seemed to him perfectible, improvable, responsive to the persistent application of reason and experiment. Yet Franklin's imagination did not rest content with abstract speculation about the distant future. He returned again to the peculiar fantasy that had seized him years before, when he had written to a correspondent of his wish that it were possible to invent a method of embalming drowned persons in such a manner that they might be recalled to life at any period, however distant. The motive behind this strange reverie was characteristically Franklin. He harbored a very ardent desire to see and observe the state of America 100 years hence. He wanted to witness what would become of the nation whose birth he had helped to midwife, to see how the great experiment would have evolved when a century had passed and he himself had long since turned to dust. There was something almost poignant in the formulation, not a wish to live forever, but a specific wish to awaken at a particular moment in the future, to take a single glimpse across the gap of generations, and then presumably return to rest. It was as though he imagined himself a seed, carefully preserved, that might germinate at an appointed hour to see how the garden had grown. This persistent fantasy about witnessing futures he would not naturally inhabit revealed something essential about the quality of Franklin's patriotism and his sense of time. His attachment to America was not merely the loyalty of one who had lived there and prospered, nor was it the blind devotion of a man emotionally bound to his birthplace. Rather, it was animated by an intellectual curiosity so intense that it transcended the natural boundary of his own lifespan. He wanted to know. He wanted to see. The American experiment was not, in his imagination, a thing already accomplished or completed, but rather an ongoing work, a process unfolding across time, and he longed to behold with his own eyes how that process had advanced. Yet even as Franklin indulged these flights of temporal fancy, he was engaged in far more tangible and practical work that would echo across the generations in ways both visible and quiet. He understood, perhaps more deeply than most of his contemporaries, that the future could be influenced not by attempting to preserve oneself within it, but by carefully constructing instruments and institutions that would continue to work long after the originating mind had departed. It was an insight born from long experience, from a life spent in the creation of things meant to endure, printing establishments that shaped public discourse, libraries that preserved and distributed knowledge, voluntary associations that mobilized communities for collective good scientific endeavors that pushed back the boundaries of the unknown.